Okay, recording this in Christmas week. I am running a little bit late with my recordings due to some unpleasant technical hitches. But leadership, again, one of those sexy topics within the world of business, and the focus tends to be on what distinguishes leadership and management. So when we think leadership within a business context, we tend to think in terms of management terms, but they're actually quite, well, subtly quite different. Leadership is the ability to influence a goal, to reach a goal, influence a group to reach a goal. Management is something much more mundane in some ways. Whereas leadership is often about influencing people, and we'll just play hopefully a bit of this clip. It's bossing people around, if you like. And I'm not hearing anything.
Settle down. How about the budget? And the taxes?
One page or less.
Anyone want better roads?
We do.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Done. A lot of paper to tell us we need clean water. Need clean water, guys? All right, this is the easiest job.
Autocratic style, with a bit of democracy thrown in, bossing people around.
From now on, you will speak only when spoken to. And the first and last words out of your filthy sewers will be, sir. Do you maggots understand that?
Sir, yes, sir.
Bullshit, I can't hear you. Sound off like you got a pair.
Sir, yes, sir.
Every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that itch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that itch. We claw with our fingernails that itch.
That inch, by the way, not that itch. I got that a little bit wrong when I first heard that. So, you know, we got a number of different styles portrayed in that little set of clips from movies, but all of them relate to being, you know, the one man. As you notice, all three were men. The one man at the middle of things in front of a group of people, pushing them through the power of spoken word or charisma or through authority to get something happening. Management doesn't quite work like that within businesses. It's rarely that sexy. It's often the use, as you can see here on the screen, the use of formal rank or status to obtain compliance. A manager often manages simply through his or her position within an organisation. They can be a fairly dull, wimpy type of person who still yields a great deal of power despite having no great verbal facility, for example. There's a quote on the wall of my office that says something along the lines of, management is the art of getting in the road of people doing what they really should be doing, but in fact, really, ideally, management is the opposite. Management is about removing hurdles from in front of people to allow them to do what they should be doing. It's about allocating tasks to people that is optimally fitted with those people's capacities in order to maximize the output of a firm. So you know, here are a number of contrasting ideas of leadership within the business context. But, you know, be aware that a lot of the traditional literature in this field is driven by this old style idea of leadership or ideal of leadership. You know, everything from Genghis Khan and Jesus were all about charisma and what we'll see is called often transformational leadership, the ability of a person through force of character to get something happening. Now, these trait theories, when we're talking trait theories, we're often talking about extroversion, which is the most powerful of the big five in determining leadership strength. I'll briefly play this. This, unlike the previous one, is a very factual and quite a brilliant piece.
Welcome to the HBR Ideacast from Harvard Business Review. I'm Sarah Green. I'm talking today with Francesca Gino, an associate professor at Harvard Business School, who who is the co-author of the December 2010 article, The Hidden Advantages of Quiet Bosses. Francesca, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So the research that you did with Adam Grant and David Hoffman shows that despite what we may assume, extroverts aren't always the best bosses. Did this finding surprise you?
Yes, it did a little bit. We were looking for situations in which introverts could do better, and we were successful in finding one, situations in which your followers were proactive.
So what kinds of experiments did you do to uncover this?
In the research, we did both field study and lab studies. In the field study, we used the survey methods. So we sent surveys to different pizza stores. And we had ratings of the leaders and a sense of whether they were extroverted or introverted. And we also had ratings of the followers for their proactive behaviors. And what's nice about that setting is that we could look at performance in terms of profits for the stores. And in the lab setting, instead, we brought people into the lab and put them in situations where they were either leaders or followers. And again, we tried to figure out whether matching proactive followers with extroverted leaders would actually lead to better performance for the group.
And in fact, what they found was the opposite. So matching proactive leaders, matching introverted leaders with proactive employees produced optimal results. This is an interesting result because it does go against the flow of research in this field, which tends to show that good leadership, one of the components is extroversion on the part of the leader, ability to socialize, connect with people, characteristics that are often seen of people who are open towards social action, extroverts in other words. But this study actually showed that the quiet reserved types did work better with a certain type of employee, which was the more proactive, self-leading type of employees. And if you think about it, I think I've talked about it previously on previous videos, some kinds of leadership can be very disempowering. It can be disempowering if you are the type of person who's a go-getter and you've got a boss telling you to go get all the time, pushing you, and taking away your freedom, which you would exercise in the support of the company's goals. It kind of has a disheartening effect on employees, or you can imagine it doing so. This is what this group found, that certain types of people who were already inclined to be quite proactive and inclined to get going on behalf of the organisation, they were facilitated, that performance, by a more stand-back, introverted kind of leader. All right. I like this study, by the way, because it's, again, they use both lab studies within kind of clinical, controlled setting, as well as field studies, going out into pizza shops and looking at real profitability of stores and how that relates to different characteristics of leaders. And they got the similar results in both formats. It's a very impressive study, so I thought I'd bring that to your attention. So effectively, when we're talking traits, remember, we're talking about characteristics of the individual differences, extroversion, introversion, proactive, not proactive, and also kind of in orientation, things like male and female. That's not what trait usually means, but we're talking about individual differences here. Behavioural models of leadership relate to the idea that that you can make good employees and you can make good leaders. It's about fostering and training of good performance. And born leaders, you basically have to choose them on the basis of their characteristics, which are pre-existing. Now, just briefly, the textbook refers to the Ohio School and Michigan School, both Midwest sort of, I think, US universities, and they both did large-scale studies of leadership decades ago. And in the case of the Ohio School, they factor analysed this huge number of surveys of what makes a good leader amongst people and found there were two characteristics, initiating structure and consideration. Now, initiating structure is about setting up an organisation so that its jobs are parceled off into appropriate little chunks and allocating it to suitable people, and providing frameworks and structures and rules and regulations. And then there's the more informal kind of human-based form of leadership, which is what they call a consideration, and it tends to be associated with employee satisfaction with leaders, as well as motivation to work. The Michigan school, I think, was slightly different, slightly better, kind of more intuitively obvious. They have employee-orientated, production-orientated. Production-orientated is the technical production aspects of a job, and the leaders focus on that, getting that right, or employee-orientated, the relationships between bosses and how that all works together. So overall, these studies did produce somewhat disappointing results, but there was evidence that the consideration or employee-orientated leaders were associated with higher job satisfaction, higher work motivation, and greater respect for leaders. So there is some support for these two well-established schools of thinking about leadership. And I'm not going to show you those because they aren't really too important, but we've got 3 contingency theories. And remember what contingency theories are. They are, this kind of leadership is good and it produces that kind of result if, and that's contingent on, if this factor takes place in between. So that's what contingency means, just to remind you. So this Fielder's model, based on this massive amount of survey work on least preferred co-worker, kind of a negative way of looking at it, but it produced some nice little clusters of information of things that people do not like about co-workers. And it was either task or relationship orientated, with 84% of us falling into one or other of these models under Fielder's model. So it captures a fair bit of variance in characteristics of leaders and followers for that matter. It is a goodness of fit theory, like we just talked about the extroverts, introverts, and the proactive employees. The assumption is that leaders are born, and that effective organisation performance depends on a fit between leadership style and situation. And the assumption is that if you don't get it right, production and performance will go down, as this chart shows. As I said in class this morning, I always get confused by visual descriptions, but effectively, if you take one part of the web, one part of this graph, and you'd see that that's task-orientated. So good performance for task-orientated types. So where the leader members relationship, these are the contingencies, is good, task structure is high, and position power, I can't remember what that is actually. I have to have a look up my textbook, is strong, whatever it is anyway. Under those conditions, task-orientated leaders produce good performance, and so on and so forth. Bottom line, Fielder claims that if things aren't going well, there's not much you can do. The leader is the leader because of a trait, and they can't change. You just have to change your leader, which is kind of harsh on the boss, isn't it? The Hersey-Blanchard theory, it's a situational leadership theory, again a goodness of fit. The assumption is that followers are either ready to do, ready for action, ready to complete a task, or they're not. And if they're not, then the leader needs to be high in task orientation, focusing employees on what has to be done. If they're ready, but they're not willing, the leader needs to be supportive and participative, provide that motivation. And if they are ready and willing, well, the leader has very little to do, effectively. Blanchard's the guy behind the 1-Minute Manager books, which you may see in remainder shops at bookstores, and he's still pumping these out, I believe. Very, very famous, and just came up with this great idea, classic, as you can see there. People like to think that everything can be cured in 1 minute in this modern world, but in fact they can't. But you can understand why something promising to solve your management problems in a brief moment of time would be popular, sold millions of copies. And then there's the path goal theory. Robert House, I don't know much about this one. It's apparently an expectancy theory of motivation. The leader provides followers with resources to achieve goals, so it's actually less, it's about a facilitative role for the manager rather than the charismatic, banging on the pulpit type of style. And supportive leadership works best with structured tasks, which is a little bit similar to the Fielder's model. Directive leadership tends to help if tasks are ambiguous or stressful, rather than when they are structured and clear, unless you've got employees who are already high in ability, high in experience, geared for action. So effectively it's saying directive leadership helps in situations that are a bit grey, unclear or stressful, and is less useful when things are going well, effectively. Vroom and Yetton's leader participation model. Basically, the key message here is how a leader makes a decision is the key. Leaders' behaviour has to adjust to the way tasks are structured in the organisation. It tends to be a normative model that tells leaders how participative to be in the decision making of a decision tree. So it's not it's not so much a trait theory again. It's more of the if or contingency theory, effectively. Not being super clear there, am I? Okay, leader-member exchange theory. This one's a lot more easy to understand. So it's fairly intuitive, and anyone who's been working in organisations will find that this rings true of their experience. So effectively, if you hang around an organisation long enough as a boss or as an employee, you'll find that things start to coalesce or cluster into either in-groups or out-groups. Effectively what that means is, bosses, popular bosses, unpopular bosses, they have certain physical characteristics. They love to eat Chinese, they wear spotted ties, or whatever characteristic you have of a boss. And bosses will tend to like people like themselves, likes like. Effectively, like birds of a feather flock together, to use another English expression. Now, what also happens is that people who want to become part of the in-crowd or the in-group tend to try and mimic aspects of the boss, because being part of the in-group has some very real advantages. Those people are more supportive of the boss, and they get more support from the boss, which is where this exchange comes into it. They get more face time with the boss, they get greater rewards and responsibilities, but they also behave in more pro-social ways, more organisational citizenship behaviours. They do have high performance ratings, which may be an illusion, by the way, because it may be simply what the leader who loves his followers sees. And as I say, it can be a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The out-groups tend to be more managed by proceduralism. Your job description is, rather than that flexible boss relationship. They receive fewer rewards, they spend less time with the boss, get less information, favours, etc., etc. And they're more likely to also engage in, disruptive behaviours, non-OCBs, if you like. So, I've used JFK as an example, but we're talking about, a more common model here, the old-fashioned model of the great man theory of leadership, as it's called in history. Charisma, the charismatic leader is associated with vision and articulation, ability to speak, ability to define a vision for the company or for the nation. It's about personal risk and sacrifice. These leaders are often, battle-hardened and people who've got the runs on the board. It's characterised often by unconventional behaviour. The example of JFK, he was a fighter pilot, I believe, or a boat captain or something like that in the war, or one of the wars. Got injured, which he suffered from injury and pain in his back for all his life. So, he gave that one a big tick. Unconventional behaviour. As we all know, he did way too much sleeping around and didn't regard the common morals of good behaviour to apply to him. Sensitivity to employees' needs. So they're good at the EI, or emotional intelligence issues. Effectively, that's fairly self-explanatory. Now, the textbook talks about, and you should familiarise yourself with these two big categories: transformational leadership, transactional leadership. Transformational leadership is the kind of charisma-related stuff. It's the charisma school. It's widely related to job performance. job satisfaction, particularly in smaller companies where you get that intimate contact with the boss. That's where the boss can really make an impact. Whereas on the Virgin level, Richard Branson, clearly his charisma does impact on the firm, but on an individual employee level, it's probably not impacting as much as everyone likes to think it does. So transformational leadership is associated with idealized influence, like the great man theory, inspirational, intellectual stimuli, ideas, vision, and individualized, personalized contact and consideration. Transactional, way more boring. It's based on rewards, management by exception, either active or passive. I'll just briefly speak to that. So by active is where you monitor for deviations from the acceptable and punish or correct that exception. Or the more passive form is you just sit there waiting until there's a problem and then you deal with it. Firefighter style. Laissez-faire, it's French word for meaning free for all, effectively. But what it really means in this context is that there is, the bosses just sit back to some degree and let things happen, rather than stand there pushing the firm into particular directions. It's more consultative and more procedural, if you like. Fair bit of literature on this. And the transactional school has lots of links to the Ohio Michigan School Fearless Model and Path Goal Theory. Okay, Malala, I think that's her name, that is a great symbol of the kind of leadership you can get from being a great person, a person who's got, high degree of values, honesty, passion, and someone who you trust. There's relatively little research in this area, but it is an emerging field, authentic leadership. And, if we believe that we can trust our leaders not to be corrupt, believe them to be honest, which is why such a big deal is made about politicians and their lies. Believe that, while we may not agree with them, we at least recognise that they mean what they say. I sometimes think that our political leaders would be much better off, instead of trying to continually pander to Australian voters, maybe say, look, this is what I'm certain needs to be done. Let's follow through on that. And I will sacrifice even votes, even popularity, even my position for it, because I believe in this. That would be an example of authentic leadership. Kind of self-explanatory. This idea of servant leadership is quite a nice one. It's quite common in Asia, where the leader isn't so much the great man hammering on, and I keep using man somewhat tongue-in-cheek, hammering on the pulpit or over the megaphone or through newsletters, but it's instead focused on gathering supporters, supporting supporters and training followers. It's kind of more social and less one-on-one level, one on the other, the followers on another level. It's working with them. They're still leading, but done in a more balanced, sort of flat way. Trust and leadership, another big factor that we need to familiarise ourselves with. And trust is a state that exists when you feel able to make yourself vulnerable to another. For example, these dreadful leadership training exercises where they have all these trust exercises where you have to throw yourself backward, blindfolded, and your fellow employees somehow have to catch you. About trust building, I think it would be somewhat unnerving, I have to say. You have a positive expectation to the consequences of relinquishing control. So employees who trust management will tend to align their behaviours and attitudes with their behaviours and requests more than those who don't, who have a distrust. So it is quite an important factor. The video is fairly useless, but what it basically says is that trust is a valuable commodity within an organisation, and that within business, for example, relationships that you build up with suppliers or with your bank, with your customers, if there is trust there, it pays back in royally. And I can speak from personal experience about this, that my relationship with my bank when I was in business was a very high level of trust, just phone call related stuff. And when I asked for something, I tended to get it, and they tended to believe me. And indeed, when my business did come to an end, I informed them very early that there was problems in the business. And by being honest and open with them, I did get back quite a bit of support during a very difficult time from my particular bank. And it was a really good example, without disclosing too much, of a good trust relationship and how that tends to support you during difficult times. So trust tends to be developed through time, tends to be developed more through actions more than words, which is kind of obvious. And as the textbook points out, there's a number of different factors that relate to these actions, you know, that if you really have the ability, whether you show that you care, whether you show that you have integrity, these things are more important than just talking trust me. And tends to lead to greater risk-taking, information sharing, group effectiveness within an organisation. So these are the outcomes that are positively related to high levels of trust. Okay, the textbook talks a little bit about mentoring. It's not something that is hugely important within organisational behaviour. It's kind of like a bit of a sidelight. But mentoring does have some interesting functions. For career functions, you know, senior staff tend to mentor junior staff, and they tend to coach them, help them with networking and forewarn them of risks, sponsor them when it comes to promotion, hold them under their wings, so to speak, and they act as a sounding board, sort of more the psychological function of being or psychologist's function of being a mentor. It's all fairly self-explanatory, and the video isn't particularly useful, but it relates to LinkedIn. I mean, it's a LinkedIn video, and for those of you who haven't yet got onto LinkedIn or considered it, I think it's a very interesting career development tool. It's kind of a living CV online, and particularly as you progress through your career and make links on LinkedIn, it's better than Facebook, certainly from a practical point of view. I sound like an advertisement for LinkedIn, don't I? But it's about building networks and gaining potential mentors through that system. I found it to be moderately successful, certainly more successful, more useful than Facebook, but that's not saying so much. I won't talk too much about this issue, but the text does make some interesting points when they say, for example, is leadership a characteristic of a person that leads to success? Or does success then cause one to think that a person has leadership ability? So, you know, I gave the example in class of Mark Zuckerberg, who probably wasn't born a great leader. He certainly showed very few early signs of being a great leader, but he's incredibly rich now. He is the leader of Facebook, and, you know, he probably now gets ascribed with all sorts of positive characteristics that are simply based on the fact that he is successful. Certainly Time magazine and, you know, the Harvard Business Review will be paying attention to Mark Zuckerberg, but would they be paying attention to Mark Zuckerberg if he wasn't successful? So it's chicken and egg sort of question. Some of the more other questions that textbook poses: can a well-organized business do without a leader? You know, if it's properly organized, and this is a particular question from transactional leadership perspective, is a leader's role, providing vision, etc., quite as important when you've got beautiful systems in place that facilitate, bring out the best in people? Another question that they ask is, can you manage remote staff who you never see? I mean, how useful is charisma, for example, when you're trying to boss or inspire someone over an email or a text message or through a Skype face-to-face session, as opposed to having that flesh and blood interaction that normally is traditionally associated with leadership? And this whole question of are leaders born or are they made? And I'll finish up with this interesting study that the textbook reports about characteristics of effective leaders, and they found that technical competence, even in a very technical company such as Google, technical competence was rated the least and most important characteristic of effective leaders by employees at Google, which takes us in the opposite direction and underlines the fact that these personal characteristics, particularly these social characteristics, the ability to use one's character or personality, maybe trust, maybe integrity, maybe charisma, these characteristics to achieve great things out of people. The coach, like we saw in that clip there, that encompassed or embodied charisma, or JFK. These are the things that people look for in leaders, even though we've moved on from that old hierarchical or feudal sort of stage of history of a few hundred years ago to a point now where we have a democracy, where we're all more on the same page, we're all more on the same level in a society like Australia. It's clear that this old style leadership is not completely lost. Anyway, thanks very much, and I'll see if I can turn off my